r/no sleep, posted by Reddit user SpaceGeneralAmerica. The Midnight Game, Part 1. 5 candles, 5 people, a box of matches or a lighter for each, 1 hour. This is what you need to play the Midnight Game. In this game, you play with one goal in mind. Don't wake them up. Who's they, you ask? They are what lies beneath us. The rules are simple. Don't make a sound. Don't leave the play area. Don't let your candle go out. And don't get scared so badly you scream. If all these rules are broken, you lose, and they win. Now listen carefully, and let me tell you what happened when I played the Midnight Game. Our play area was an old abandoned asylum, known as Hammond's Ward. I played the Midnight Game with my friends, Carlton, Josie, Greg, and Benny. Benny was the one who learned about the Midnight Game. He was an amateur occultist during his emo phase, and so when he learned of this particular urban legend, he had to play for himself. Only he needed 4 others to play. Naturally, his friends were his first choice. 5 12-year-olds, playing some kind of occult ritual? What could go wrong? I thought it was a joke when he asked me to play with him. When he insisted, I went along, solely because I thought it would be rather amusing. I tried Bloody Mary with Benny once, and nothing happened. We'd gone to haunted houses looking for ghosts. Nothing happened. Still convinced the supernatural was real, despite all his ventures turning up nothing. This time would be no different. I told him as much. How wrong I was. Benny explained the Midnight Game to us when we reached the asylum. It was a little-known urban legend that went as follows. Supposedly, there are things that lie beneath our notice, and they can be contacted through specific ritual, the Midnight Game. In this game, 5 people with 5 candles would sit in a circle, 1 candle for each. If the candle went out, it had to be relit as soon as possible. At some point, they could leave the circle, but not the designated play area. Another specific was that the Midnight Game had to be played in an area that had seen great suffering. Benny didn't need to explain that, as an asylum had a history all on its own. Sexual abuse of patients, multiple suicides, lobotomies. It had it all. Benny had even taken me here once trying to find ghosts. We didn't. That asylum is an eerie place nonetheless. Spray painted on the walls, often upside down crosses and pentagrams. And the empty bottles made me realize that we weren't the first people here. I wondered if anyone would come back. A place doesn't need ghosts to be horrific. Sometimes people are all that is needed. There was one last rule of the Midnight Game Benny told us. Don't say a word. We can't speak for a full hour. We'd need a timer of some sort to ensure that an hour had passed. So Greg set a timer on his phone. Benny took us to one of the cells, and that's where we played the Midnight Game. I asked him why the cell, and he said 1 door was best. I asked him where he'd found this, and when he said it was some internet forum, I rolled my eyes, about ready to leave. I only stayed because my other friends did, and I didn't want to look like a pussy in front of them, especially Josie. We sat in a circle and passed out the candles. No 2 were identical. Mine was long and thin and red. Josie's was orange and plump. Benny's was a black cylinder. Greg's a yellow stick. Carlton had a green stick. Benny explained one last thing before we started. We have to light our candles clockwise, he said. And in the last minute before midnight, what time is it? Greg pulled out his phone. 11:58, no, 59, just changed. Benny breathed a sigh of relief, then lit his candle first. 1 hour, he said. 1 hour of your time. That is all we ask. I went next, then Josie, then Greg, then Carlton, who rolled his eyes. Once we'd lit our candles, Benny held out his hand. We hold our hands, he said, to show that we are united in this. I felt goofy taking his hand, but it was nice to have Josie holding mine. Once Carlton had grumbled and grabbed Betty's hand, he continued. "We are 5 seeking to play with you," he continued. 5 people with 5 candles. We seek to play the midnight game with you. Do you seek to play the midnight game with us? Silence. Absolute silence. That was what answered Benny. I opened my mouth to say this was stupid when I realized how quiet it was. I took in a breath, felt the air go down my throat, but I didn't hear a thing. I tapped my foot against the floor gently, not a sound. In the pit of my stomach, dread crept in. I looked over to Benny, alarmed, but he seemed entranced by the flame of his candle. "If you wish to play," he said, "give us a sign." His voice penetrated the silence, the only sound any of us could hear. I looked over at Josie, who moved her mouth as if she was saying something, but nothing was coming out. I glanced over at Carlton and Greg, who had expressions that mirrored both Jessie and my own. "Give us a sign," Benny said suddenly, like he was demanding for them to obey him, but not with any genuine force. He was desperate, hoping beyond hope that this would work, that his interest in the occult and the supernatural wasn't pointless, that he would be able to show his face to his friends again. I could guess that was what was going through his head at that moment. Nothing happened. We waited, breath held, wondering what we had gotten ourselves into, but nothing happened. Benny sighed and opened his mouth to speak. I could see it in his eyes, the disappointment that this hadn't worked. Did he notice how quiet it was? The black cylinder in front of Betty was blown out by a gust of air. Benny froze, staring at the smoke ring from the burnt wick. Then he quickly pulled out a match and struck it and relit the candle. He smiled and turned to us. The disappointment was gone, replaced by an excited glee. I don't think he realized the severity of what was happening. "The game is on," he said. "It will begin in 3, 2, 1. All our candles went out instantly. In the panic to relight them, I didn't notice that the silence was gone. It was only after I stared at my long, thin candle, the red wax melting from the wick, that I realized I could hear the others breathing. I looked up, staring at my friends one by one. They were all as bewildered as I, save Benny. I wanted to speak, to say something, but Benny had said we couldn't speak for the full hour. After what had happened, did I want to risk something going wrong? The silence was broken by a voice, but it wasn't one of us. "What do we have here?" It said, soft as a child's. "Players," said another voice, identical to the first. "Players for the midnight game. It's been so long since I've seen players for the midnight game." "What a joy, what a joy," said a third voice. What a joy, it's been so long since I've played the midnight game." "I've never played," said a fourth voice. "What do we do?" "Come," said a fifth voice, "and let me show you." I didn't even breathe, wondering if I had imagined the voices. I glanced up at Benny, whose eyes were wide with excitement and shock. "What the fuck, man?" Carlton said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Fuck this, I'm leaving." He grunted, and as I stared at him, watching dumbfounded at how much he seemed to be trying to push himself up off the ground, I couldn't but notice the indents forming on the shoulders of his coat, like fingers as thin as pencils. "What the fuck?" Carlton spoke softly, his voice quivering. I couldn't help looking around the filthy room. Each one of my friends had eyes as wide as mine. Benny was glancing behind him, at nothing, or so it seemed. I wanted to ask him what he was doing, but then my candle went out. I hastily struck a match and lit the candle before turning back to Benny. He wasn't staring at the wall anymore. He was looking directly at his candle, face pale. Briefly, his wet eyes glanced up and met mine. He didn't need to say anything to convey his regret, one I shared. There was a squeaking sound from outside, and we all glanced at the door. It was a sharp, painful, metallic slow squeaking that seemed to stretch throughout the asylum. It got closer and closer with every second. In anticipation, we waited for whatever horror would pass by the door. An empty, rusty wheelchair came into view on the other side of the door frame before it came to a stop. Slowly turning on its crooked wheels, it faced us. The left front wheel lurched forward into the room suddenly, then the right one. It lurched slowly, wheel by wheel, into the room until it was past the door, then stopped. "What the fuck?" Carlton said, the indents on his shoulders tightening. "Shh," said the fifth voice, suddenly. "Shh. You don't want to wake them up, do you?" That phrase sunk in slowly. Wake them up. Them. They hadn't woken up yet. The fifth voice continued to speak. "They aren't awake yet," it said. "If they're awake, you will all lose. Now, pick up your candles. Get to your feet. It's time to play the midnight game. You know the goal. Do you not? Don't wake them up." There was a pause before it continued to speak. As it did, I couldn't help noticing the way the indents on Carlton's shoulders tightened. "If they wake up, we win." I glanced at each of my friends in turn before turning back to Carlton. The fifth voice spoke again. "This one has already spoken. They are stirring now, but are not yet awake. It is only fair if none of you speak for the rest of the game, is it not? Yes, but can you stop yourselves from screaming?" Carlton didn't. He reached up an arm as he was suddenly yanked back into darkness and vanished. I was about to cry out, but Benny held up a hand in the other, candle held high as he pointed it at the darkness. Carlton was back, but his face was long and gaunt, his hair white, his eyes were wide, his entire body shaking. He opened his mouth and nothing came out. "One player," the fifth voice said, "has lost the midnight game." There was a soft giggle from the other four voices. Then all five spoke together. "One down, 4 left." I've heard it said the oldest and strongest human emotion is fear, and the oldest and strongest fear is the fear of the unknown. Speaking from my time playing the midnight game, I can safely say this is true. None of us knew what had just happened to Carlton, nor did we want to know. Just looking at his gaunt face was enough to send a chill down my spine, and the voices were still speaking in unison. 1 down, 4 left. 1 down, 4 left. 1 down, 4 left. They were chanting it over and over. I put my hands over my ears, trying to blot it out. Then my candle went out. I immediately tried to relight it when I felt a hand touch my arm. I glanced up instantly to find myself looking into Josie's face. It was covered in panic as she pointed to the door. I only just struck the match when something moaned. It wasn't one of the voices. It was human. The deep guttural feral groan of a man. The voices ceased chanting. "Interesting," said the fifth voice. "It would appear someone else is here, not a player of the midnight game." There were a few seconds of silence. A clink of glass from the door. Benny, Greg, Josie, and I all looked at it. An empty bottle was rising slowly into the air, suspended by invisible hands that left pencil-thin markings in the dust. "Run." It was the fifth voice. Then the bottle lurched up into the air before violently dropping onto the floor. It shattered, glass sparkling in the moonlight. A feral scream followed instantly. I barely remember grabbing my candle and booking it out of the cell. Josie was the first out the door, and I trailed behind her. We both jointly pushed the wheelchair out of the way, and it landed on its side, with a loud crash as part of it cracked. The glass shards cracked under my shoes, and that of my friends. Heavy footsteps were thudding down the hallway towards us, while a horrific screaming accompanied it. I struggled not to yell and scream in panic. Somehow, None of my friends did either. Josie and Greg were sprinting down the hall in front of me, not daring to look back. I wanted to call out and beg them to wait up, but the heavy breathing next to my ear made me pause. I glanced over my shoulder to find Carlton's gaunt, pale face following me. His white hair contrasted against the darkness around us. A blank look was on his face, and his unlit candle was clasped in front of his chest. He pushed past me without a glance, slamming me against the wall as he seemed to glide down the hallway. My candle fell into the ground, flame going out. I bent down to pick it up, relit it, then heard something else fall to the ground. Benny groaned in pain. I looked over, and my heart dropped. Benny had tripped over the upended wheelchair, dropping his candle. Smoke drifted from the burnt, unlit wick. Benny's hand gritted against the broken glass as he lifted one up and reached for the black candle. Shards of glass were stuck in his palm, blood trailing down it. He grabbed the candle, and Benny began to get to his feet. The thundering footsteps were almost on top of us. I was already rushing back to help Benny onto his feet when the candle suddenly lurched out of his hand, spinning across the ground. Then it stopped and slowly lifted in the air. When it flew in a curve through the air, Benny was already on his feet and caught it, already trying to strike a match. I stared with wide eyes as the footsteps began to round the corner at the very end of the hallway. "No," said one of the voices. "No, he's not supposed to." "Rules," said the fifth voice, "are to be followed, not bent. But how can we by not resorting to cheating?" The fifth voice hissed back. "Now, players, do as I told you. Run." In the moonlight at the end of the hallway, a massive towering figure lurched into view. Head, a bush of hair. The feral screams became the howl of an animal. I raced forward, grabbed Benny by the arm and began dragging him forward. He shook me off and then fell into step beside me. Behind us, the howling was getting closer. The hallway split into 3 different directions at an intersection, not including the one we were already in. I glanced at Benny and pointed my finger to the right, then at him, still running. We were so close, Benny didn't need to be told twice what to do. The instant we reached the intersection, he took the right, and I turned to follow him. I slipped on a bottle, almost falling to the ground before I could steady myself. Benny paused, watching with wide eyes, and turned, about to help me, when I held up a free hand. The howling was almost on top of us. Without thinking, I began running in the opposite direction. I looked back once to see Benny watching me go with pained expressions before he ran into another direction. Then his form was obscured by a hulking figure, which howled at me. He chased me throughout the asylum, relentless in his pursuit. I don't know how I managed to evade him, ducking under broken doors that hung out of their frames limply. I swear I could feel his hot breath on the back of my neck, but he never managed to grab me. I knew that if his hands wrapped around my neck, I'd be done for. After I took another corner, then ducked into an abandoned room, his screams grew distant. I kept running, ignoring the way my lungs screamed in protest as I tried to find somewhere to hide. I stopped when I pushed through a set of double doors and found myself into what have been the kitchen. Old pots and pans littered the floor, along with knives that were covered in dark rust. Spatulas, large serving spoons, and other cooking utensils I couldn't name for the life of me. I began frantically looking around, trying to figure out where to hide. I opened one of the old fridges and gagged at what I saw inside. It was the remnants of a rat covered in fat, wiggling maggots. I slammed the door shut on instinct. There was a grunt from the distance, just outside the double doors. And then, heavy footsteps. I scolded myself for being so stupid. The heavy footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by grunting and deranged mumbles. I looked around and ran into one of the cupboards, opening it and shoving myself inside. The candle was my only illumination. As the footsteps got closer, I glanced down at the edge of the cupboard door, open just a crack so I could breathe. Light from the candle was spilling out of it. Without thinking, I blew on my candle and hunched into the cupboard, already digging into my pockets for matches. Then the doors burst open. I froze. I could hear the deep guttural voices of a crazy man speaking incomprehensibly. The footsteps that plodded through the kitchen kicked aside everything in their path. A clatter of rust as something was broken apart. The slamming of a door. Discomfort crept in my body as I crouched inside that cupboard. Back ached. The footsteps continued to creep throughout the kitchen. Glass crunched close to me, and I cupped my hands over my mouth to stifle my gasps. Smoke drifted upward from the long, thin candle in my other hand. The footsteps came to a stop directly in front of me, and a shadow was standing in front of the cupboard door. The intelligible mumbling from directly in front of me carried a distinct tone of menace to it. Unhinged, should I say. When something shuffled, the shadow moved. Just under the crack I could see the bare, filthy foot of a man with yellow fungus-infested toenails. Then the other foot came into view. Both feet turned, coming to a stop directly in front of my cupboard. The mumbling was replaced by a long, deep sniff. Then, something banged on top of the cupboard. I bit my tongue so hard it began to bleed. Another bang above me, then several more poundings. The man was battering down, howling with rage. Tears began to roll down my face. I was going to die here. Then the battering stopped, as did the howling. I listened closely, as I heard a metallic squeak followed by a door slamming shut. The feet with yellow claw-like toenails shuffled away. I waited until I heard them growing faint, the intelligible mumbling fading with them. I pulled out my matches, lit one, and held my candle steady as I put the flame on the wick. I breathed a sigh of relief when a burning flame was now on top of it, then blew out the match. Then, slowly, the cupboard door opened, coming to a stop when it was halfway from me. Dust on the inside of the door had been distributed, leaving pencil-thin markings where the dust had been swept away. I waited, with bated breath. The door shot forward, and I winced. It didn't slam shut, however. It stopped just before it could shut completely, an inch from the cabinet. I jumped and dropped my candle when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I instantly grabbed my candle before the flame could go out, holding it close to my face as I pulled out my phone. It was a text message from Josie. My friends and I had set up a group chat for easy contact. I wasn't relieved to see Josie's message. However, what she had sent made my blood run cold. Guys, I'm in the basement, and I think I can hear something. I was the first to send a message back. Josie, get out of the basement now. I watched as the 3 small dots appeared in a text box before her reply came through. I can't. There's something upstairs blocking the door. I can hear one of the voices, whispering from the top. I think it's singing. I gulped when I saw another message, this time unmistakably from Benny. Josie, I'll try to help you. Greg, Larry, are you guys with Carlton? Greg answered first. I thought he was with one of you guys. My heart skipped in my chest, then grimly sent another message. Guys, Carlton isn't with me. There wasn't any text box with small dots for a few seconds as that settled in. Just when I saw Benny begin typing, it happened. There was a sharp scraping sound, like stones were being dragged along the metallic ground. The asylum began to shake and lurch. Not like an earthquake was happening beneath our feet. This was different. It felt like the asylum was moving. A voice spoke right next to my ear. They are stirring. Then Josie sent another message. Guys, something's wrong down here. Something's really wrong. I'm not alone. I'm scared. I can hear something screaming. I don't think it's human. Damn it, Benny, why did you convince us to play this game? Benny was just beginning to answer when the shaking stopped. Outside the cupboard, a dull green light was oozing through the crack. My phone buzzed, and I checked the message. It was from Greg. Guys, he began. I'm looking out the window and I don't think we're on Earth anymore.